Thank you, Yaroslav and Pasha, for making the last-minute arrangements to get me here. I just arrived this morning, so I was super jet lagged. I just got this Red Bull, and I realized the value proposition of this product. I'm up. That's what is growth. So, a little quick introduction about myself. So, right now, like Yaroslav mentioned, I do growth at Adobe. It's a new function that we're creating in Adobe. We are trying to scale it up, still pretty nascent. At Uber, I was leading the lifecycle marketing team, and during my time there, I grew it from like 4 people to 40 people, email marketers, into like a much broader team, right? And then eBay again, I was there when it was a very small team, and then we grew that team as well. So I know a little bit of how to scale and build growth teams, and I want to share those experiences with you guys today, and mostly focus on the principles that I learned the hard way, and some of the things I learned from my peers, and also want to give you guys a few examples of how we did growth, so that you can possibly apply in your day-to-day work, right? So let's get started. Okay, so what is a growth team? Before that, even what is growth, right? So if you look at growth, it's both acquisition and retention, right? So you want to acquire new customers, and you want to make sure you retain them, right? So growth, essentially, is everybody's business in a company, right? Who in a company would say, I'm not working on growth, or growth is not my focus? Absolutely not. Everybody is focused on growth. When a company is really small, it's very clear that everybody's focused on growth. But when a company grows bigger, that's when silos form, teams are optimizing for a local maximum, and so the focus gets lost. That's why you need to build these growth teams that can bring that rigor and focus back together. So the way I define growth teams are self-contained team that owns and drives a business metric through rigorous testing techniques and practices, right? So a self-contained team, autonomous team which can work quickly, it's very nimble, and make decisions on the fly, right? So that's important. Drives a business metric. That's the focus for you guys. Like, what is the KPI that the growth team owns and drives? And then finally, using data and A/B testing, rigorous A/B testing. That's, in a nutshell, what I think is a growth team. Now need to get used to using clicker. Let's talk about scaling growth teams, right? So in my experience, there are 5 main pillars to scale growth teams: team structure, culture, process, people, and technology, right? So let's talk about the team structure first. Show of hands, how many people today work on a growth team? All right. How many people aspire to be on a growth team? It's great. What about the rest? Just learning about growth. That's great. So, growth is at various different stages at different companies, right? Like I mentioned at Adobe, it's pretty nascent. We're trying to form that. Some other bigger companies where growth has already established, their credibility, much bigger teams. So when a team is really small, or growth is trying to prove, growth team is trying to prove their credibility in the company, we can just start with a designer and an engineer, right? I remember my eBay days when I started working on the growth team. The only other person working along with me was a designer, right? Now, what can you do? You're like just the 2 of you, and what can you do? So the first thing that I did was focus on an area that wasn't really owned by anyone, right? So at eBay, there was a marketing team that did batch and blast. They focused a lot on the onboarding series, on how do you get a buyer or seller onboarded. But the area that wasn't really tackled was the triggers, like email triggers. If someone does an action within eBay, like a watch a item, or add it to the cart, there wasn't really much communicated that way. So we said, okay, let's focus on that area, and let's see if we can get some traction, right? So we focused on trigger emails, and the designer used to mock up emails pretty quickly, and then we used to send it out in an A/B test, and we found that it drove so much GMB. GMB is a term for revenue, or gross merchandise bought, right? And we were like, the product teams are all over it, and they said, hey, we want to support this. We have engineers, and that's how we started to scale out, right? But you need to focus on an area which is not owned by anyone, and you can see a clear impact that you can make, right? So that's, when you're a small team trying to prove credibility. When you become a much bigger team, I feel like there are five, or I think there are five key roles people play within a growth team. So it starts with the product manager, a designer, engineer, marketer, and a data analyst, right? Now the question is, where should these people be? Should they all be housed within one organization, like Facebook has it, or used to have it? Or should they be dispersed across different teams, right? In my opinion, it really doesn't matter. As long as these different functions or team members sit together, they have a common goal, and then try to move that metric, I think it's fine, right? It doesn't matter where they are in the organization. So let's talk a little bit about the roles of these people on the team. So product manager, this is, if you want a successful growth team, this is going to be a key hire, right? This is the person who sets the culture of your team. This is the person who's going to set the direction of the team, who's going to enable people to come together, right? Most often than not, what I've seen is when growth teams fail, it's probably because the product manager is not inclusive enough, is not bringing in the ideas a designer might have or an analyst might have. And so it becomes so much more important for PM to incorporate all those feedback and learnings and get that team together, right? So that's your critical hire. Second is a marketer. I wouldn't say this is any ordinary marketer. This is the person who is doing this the growth marketing, basically very data-driven, right? So they understand and realize the importance of A/B testing, and they are ready to learn other tools. So for instance, at Uber, we had email marketers, but they were not shy of learning about in-app notifications or SMS, and how do you combine them with an email notification, right? So all of that is something that's needed, right? And a growth marketer brings that skill set. Probably walk to this side so that I can speak to this side of the audience as well. The third group is a designer, right? Oh, it's following me. All right. So the designer, is someone who's very versatile, right? So if you look at designers like to work on certain specific problems. And traditional designers, they want to get 100% of their work right and perfect. But a growth designer is happy with 80%. They want to get their product out there. They want to learn, and they want to then iterate and improve on it, right? So that's what that's the kind of designer you want to hire. Engineer, not all engineers would be excited about working on growth, right? Engineers want to build products. They want to be in the core product. So you want to hire an engineer who is excited about growth, who wants to leverage data, and who can use that data to kind of fuel. They're excited by the metrics and the numbers and the impact that they can make. So that's the person you want to hire. And data analyst, and this is a pretty key role on the team, because a lot of these tests that happen, they have to be designed properly. If your A/B tests are not designed properly, you're not going to learn anything from your test, right? At the same time, not all tests are going to be successful, so you want to learn, from the tests that fail. And so this is the person who brings those insights. All right. So, talking about culture, now that we talked about team structure, what's the culture? And we touched about experimentation, right? One common theme that you might have seen in all the roles that I described before is data and the orientation towards experimentation, right? I think that's a key aspect of hiring anyone on the growth team, right? And so experimentation mindset is one of the most important things you need to build within the growth team. So experimentation is like, not all experiments are going to be successful, right? 1 in 20 experiments might be successful, right? So my VP, John Copeland at Adobe, he calls this as finding a needle in the haystack, right? It's that difficult. But once you find it, the question is, how do you amplify the impact of that? How do you work with campaign marketing? How do you work with a core product team and bring the learnings that you found through growth to the broader organization? I think that's the critical piece, and that's the role that growth should play, right? Move fast, learn faster. I think, like I said, 1 in 20 experiments are successful. What can you learn from the 19 experiments, right? That didn't work. I sometimes think about them as like metal detectors, right? So you use them to find where you need to go and dig. So those 19 experiments that failed for the hypothesis that you were testing, you know that these are the areas that didn't work for you. So you wouldn't want to spend time, invest time there more for the hypothesis that you're testing. So that's how I see it. And then lastly, most important, not everything needs to be experimented through product. This is such a key point because many of these experiments that we did, that I did at eBay and Uber, were simple email experiments, right? Because engineering effort is always expensive and it's hard to get. So how do we focus on getting these experiments out in the market quickly and learn from it? So emails were the best way. And I'll give you an example. On eBay, if there is an inventory that's going out pretty quickly, not everybody knew about it, right? So if I was watching an item or I had added an item to a cart, and if the demand was pretty high, I wasn't told that if you don't buy it tomorrow, it's going to go out, right? So one of the things we started experimenting in the email was, hey, this is the item that you watch. There are 20 other people watching this item. It might go out soon, right? Guess what? Pretty quickly, we saw that the inventory there was a lot more engagement. People started buying that item more. And we were customer-centric because we told customer ahead of time that don't be disappointed, right? So it worked so well that the product team actually took that. And if you go to the eBay pages, I haven't seen it more lately, but if you go to the eBay pages, you can actually see against the item like a hot symbol, right? If it's really hot and the item is selling through fast, you can really see that symbol which tells you that you might want to act fast. So I can't emphasize this more. Like, don't feel constrained that you need an engineering or you need a product support to do experiments. Do with whatever channels available to you, notifications, email, SMS, and so on. Next is breaking organizational silos. All right. So first thing is the growth teams. They take a very holistic approach, right? It's not that, hey, I'm in this part of the funnel and I'm trying to optimize this metric for that funnel. Yeah, of course you are, but we're trying to move that metric. There are a lot of other factors that impact it, right? Right from when you acquire a customer to how they get onboarded to that particular phase in your funnel, and then with customer retention, customer support, and so on, right? So in the growth team, you probably want to look at that that journey holistically, right? And I'll give you an example about Adobe and Lightroom as a product. So there are 2 Lightroom products right now. So Lightroom Classic, which is focused desktop, and Lightroom CC, which is more like a cloud product. And when we were looking at the cloud product, we realized that the conversions were pretty low. People used to install it, launch it, but then they never use it. And so we were like, hey, let's look further up the funnel. Let's try to optimize it. But then we couldn't get any sense of why that's happening. And then we started looking at Lightroom Classic, and we saw that these customers who were not launching Lightroom CC were actually launching Lightroom Classic. And they shifting there. So there was a confusion between people not knowing which version to use, right? Had we not zoomed out and taken that picture in mind and understood where customers are going, we would have completely missed it. So knowing that, we then went to the website and where people actually sign in, we actually clearly tell them what is a Lightroom Classic versus what's a Lightroom CC product, right? So that helped improve in the conversion in the funnel. Build connections with different parts of the organization. So building connections with different part of the at Uber, we are trying to onboard drivers, right? So when we onboard drivers, it's a very cumbersome process. There's a bunch of offline work that needs to be done. There's a bunch of online work that needs to be done. Huge effort. So we tried to optimize the flow. We tried to optimize the steps, but it didn't move the metric much. But then when we spoke to the customer agent team, they were trying to do some pilots around how can we call people, drivers who are trying to sign up, and tell them, guide them, right? And so we did a pilot where we said, okay, why don't we bring this chat support online and let it be manual chat. So we will route people from here on the online chat to the customer agent, and let us answer their questions. And so we did it as an A/B experiment, and we saw like huge improvement in conversion rates, right? Step change. This is not something that we thought, and we always focused on the product aspect of it. And so knowing that, then we started to build a chatbot, which was intelligent enough to know the context, why a driver was asking, or what the driver was asking, and being able to respond to that, so that we can then scale and grow in volume. So I think that was an example of how connecting with different teams that are trying to solve the problem helps to come up with a better solution. The last one, ask for forgiveness instead of permission. This might be a little controversial, but that's my philosophy, is if there is a customer experience that hasn't been improved because a certain team owns a charter, but they are not resourced to do it because they have other things on the roadmap, I think as part of growth team, you should just take it on. You should just go and do it. And then, because you want to make sure that the customer experience is the best, right? And I want to share an example from eBay, where eBay used to do a lot of coupons, right? So batch and blast email, coupons to everybody, open rates. We know the open rates, how many people engage with email, how many people can be reached through emails. Pretty low, pretty small, right? So how do we, and the redemption rate of the coupon were pretty low. So we said, how do we get this up, right? We said, okay, there are other emails that these same users receive, and they're pretty excited about it. They open those emails, and they engage with those emails. What if we just surface these coupons as a module within those emails, right? So the user can see their content, plus they can see if they are interested in buying an item, they have a coupon that they're eligible for, right? So just go buy it. And so we did that. And when we did that, we not only saw that the engagement of the existing email went up higher, but the redemption rate also went up higher, right? Now, the coupon team, of course, had their own view around, like, hey, whether or not you should do it. But ultimately, it was a win-win, right? Both for the team that in the email where we surfaced the coupon, and the coupon team itself, right? So that's an example I wanted to give you around, go and do it. Improve the customer experience, and people will be happy. Sorry. All right. Customer centricity. I can't emphasize this enough. Like, I think this is by far, at least for me personally, what has helped me in my career is being able to put myself in the customer's shoes and really learn from them, right? And have empathy towards what they're experiencing within the product. An example of that comes to my mind. Ed Baker, who used to be the VP of growth at Uber, he was a big proponent of you guys should go and use the product. So he got a bunch of his team members to go and actually drive and take a first trip and see how the experience is and note it down. When he actually took his first trip, he found that he had completed all the process. He walked to his car, and then he wasn't able to drive because he was anxious. someone stranger sitting behind in my car. How am I going to do it? So he walked back, and then he sent the team a note. He sent all of us a note saying that, hey, it is so hard for a person who works at Uber to do this. How about, like, for a person who is just starting, who has no context? It's going to be really hard. And so, we took that learning, and then we built out some experiences around it, both within the product and within email, where email was like a simple checklist of things that, hey, these are the 4 things that you need to do before you feel comfortable that you can take your first passenger in. On the product, we showed, there were certain things that we did to show that, make it easier for the driver to find a ride, right? And so that dramatically changed our, first trip rate. For people who had done all the steps, all the cumbersome steps, and were hesitant on taking the first trip, this helped them, right? So that's the kind of insight you would never get by just looking at data, right? You need to be actually using the product. Talk and gather feedback from customers. This is something we're doing at Adobe right now, where, in addition to running experiments, we are collecting feedback from customers real time on how those experiments are performing, or what do they think about these treatments that they're receiving. And it's all automated because we can't afford to have so many, calling people, and having interviews. That's not scalable. So we actually we scaled it through Slack, where we have the survey which goes out through email to these customers who receive the treatment with a specific set of questions, and when they responded, it's all sent back automatically to Slack to all the growth members who are working on it. And then on the back end, we are analyzing the data that we are using NLP to kind of categorize them into these different sentiments and different categories, buckets of why this experiment did or did not work for the user. So that's really helping us hone down into making an experiment really effective. And then finally, understand your customer segments, right? So when you look at these metrics at an aggregate level, it never tells you a story. It might tell you at a high level, but when you start to break it down, that's when you really get the insight of who are the customers. You might, on Adobe, you have professional customers and you are hobbyists. And the retention rate for these 2 customer segments are very different. The behavior is very different. So those kind of insights would come only when you start to really understand who your customers are. All right, process. So with any growth team, it's really important to have a good process in place and that all your teams follow that process. It's a consistent process. Here's a way that I do it. I did it at eBay, Uber, and it's worked for me. I'm doing it at Adobe right now. It all starts with discovery, which is both qual and quant. You're trying to understand what the customer problem is, what the customer opportunity is. And then you go and size and prioritize. That's the part that is sometimes not done properly, right? Teams would come up with an idea or a hypothesis. They will just go try do it without really knowing, hey, how big an impact can it make? What is the effort involved? I think that's the due diligence that the PM needs to make in order to make sure that the teams are working on the most important and the most impactful projects. Next is test design and execution, right? And I talked about this earlier. It is so important to know what you want to learn from a particular test, right? Are you trying to learn about a particular segment? Are you trying to learn about a particular copy message that you're trying to send? And you then need to decide what the A/B test should look like or what your test strategy should look like. Quite often, I've seen teams just go design an A/B test, and then they come back and say, hey, it worked, or I don't know if it worked. I don't know if it worked, which segment did it work for? Can I replicate this again? I think that's the part that gets missed when you don't design tests properly. Measurement. Measurement is making sure you have a key primary metric that you're measuring. In teams, sometimes I've seen teams try to measure many, many different things, like 4 or 5 different things in an experiment. That doesn't work. You need to know your primary metric that you're going to measure, and then call an experiment successful or unsuccessful based on that primary metric. Otherwise, it's just chance. It's not going to be statistically valid. And then, most important, The thing that differentiates really great teams from average teams is that the great teams, they take the time to learn about experiments that didn't work, why it didn't work. They spend the time, they do the due diligence, and that's what really helps them move forward. All right. North Star metric. How many of you guys have heard about this term, North Star metric? Great. Reforge is doing a great job. So North Star metric is basically, you want to identify, for every product, you want to identify what is the core value proposition of the product. In this case, when I walked in, it was a Red Bull, just drank it, my jet lag is gone, right? So what is the core value proposition of the product, and how do you get the user to experience it very quickly? For instance, in Photoshop, if you look at Photoshop in Adobe, there are so many features. And if someone new comes in, they're going to get lost pretty soon. Instead, why don't we walk them through like the one or two things, which is either editing, layer, or hue. If you guys have used Photoshop, you know what I'm talking about. And you can see the instant impact that it can make on a user's behavior, and they get activated. And then they do that behavior again and again and again. And you know that after they do it for a certain amount of time, it becomes a habit. That's your North Star metric, and you should be able to do quant and qual to recognize what the North Star metric for your product is, and then rally your team behind that North Star metric. Everything that you should do in your activation journey or your active use, make sure that the efforts are behind the North Star metric. They're all aligned. And the other important piece, which teams miss, is then translating the North Star metric to the business metric, right? So more often than not, we'll say, okay, 8 edits, let's say in Photoshop, in 28 days is the North Star metric. What does it mean? For an exec, it doesn't mean anything. It's like, hey, are we getting more monthly active users? Are we retaining more users? And so building that bridge between the North Star metric and what the actual business metric is becomes really important to show how the efforts that you're doing within growth is impacting your broader organization, right? Focus. When growth teams are successful, it creates a lot of excitement in the company. A lot of teams want to come and partner with you. And if you don't have a clear agenda, if you don't have a clear priority, hey, these are the 4 things that we're going to focus on, you can pretty quickly get derailed, right? You can work on like 5 or 6 different like interesting things, but they might not all lead to the metric that you're working on, right? So one of the things that I tell my team is ruthlessly prioritize. Say no to things that are outside, the things that don't impact your North Star metric or the metric that you're trying to measure, right? So I think that's really important. Building a growth model. Chris, I think earlier I missed his talk, but I think he talked about building a growth model. That is so important. It's a foundational to a successful growth team. A growth model tells you what are the levers, where should you focus, where should you put your efforts. And so I think for any good growth team, it doesn't have to be really fancy. It has to be something really simple that can be understood, which gives you an idea about what are the relative impact of the different levers that you have to either move engagement or retention. I think as long as you know that, I think taking that and then building a strategy behind that is going to be really helpful. Okay, team sport. Growth is a team sport. I can't stress this enough. I've seen growth PMs who want to be individual heroes not succeed in their role. This is, like I mentioned, we talked about the team structure. It is so important for not only the growth PM, but everyone else on the team to be collaborative, to be inclusive, to interact with the rest of the organization, to bring in thoughts, to share learnings with the rest of the organization. That's what builds trust. And people who tend to go in a silo and try to work on their own particular thing, not share things around, doesn't work. Doesn't work. It builds mistrust within the organization, and teams don't want to cooperate. Your designer doesn't want to work. and so on. So I think that's by far the most important thing you need to build a successful growth team. We covered some of these already. All right, what kind of people you want to hire for your team, right? So you talk about, we always talk, I mean, a lot of us have heard about the T, right? You have a broad set of skill set and you're really an expert in one. I was fortunate enough to have 4 unicorns on my team at Uber when I started. They were all email marketers, right? But they were good at SQL. They were good at design. They were good at understanding marketing tech, right? And so that made my job so much easy. And we were able to drive things at a much faster velocity than most of the organization. And that helped us build scale and build the case that we need to grow this organization much bigger, right? And so the thing that you want to keep in mind when you're hiring people is not everybody is going to be as lucky as me, as having like all the skill set. But they should have the mindset that they want to widen their skill set, and they also want to increase their expertise, right, within whatever domain or field that they have the expertise in. So I think that's the thing that you need to make sure you look for in the person whom you hire. And finally, technology is such a big enabler. It'll help your people move at a much faster rate, and also make sure that the processes that you have put in place and the things that we talked about, they're all implemented in the right way, and they all execute in the right way. So growth teams, so good growth teams, they do all of this, right? So they do A/B testing, they have data science, they have like their email notification platform, in-product platform. They have all of that, but they're all kind of independent, right? Now what happens is, if a person has to grow fast, they have to, test an A/B platform separately, get the readout, so there's a separate data pull that they need to do, pass it on to the data science team. The data science team will build a bunch of models. They will need to work with engineers to productionalize it. So it's just, even though the steps are right, it just takes forever to get there. Whereas at Uber, one of the brilliant things that the team did there was to combine these platforms. So the data science platform feeds into the communications platform. The A/B testing platform is also part of the communications platform. So when you send an email out, you not only know how it's performing against your control, but you also learn, and that learning actually feeds your data science model, which was used for personalization, right? So it'll learn whether or not this person is likely to open this kind of email again, right? So I think it's all built in, and then because of that, the velocity at which you can test just goes up rapidly, right? So I think that's something you keep in mind you won't have it immediately, but as you think about scale, as you think about scaling your team, you should start to think about, how do I address this? How do I build these building blocks, elements, with the end vision in mind? So to sum it up, team structure, as I mentioned, there isn't one that fits all. It's like, it depends on your organization, where you are, where your leaders are, and how acceptable growth is within your organization. Culture, collaborative, and experimentation. Process, rigorous, based on data, right? And focused on one single metric. People who are nimble and data-oriented. And lastly, technology that enables your people and process, right? So that's kind of summary of my learnings. There's plenty more, but I thought I'll share with this group these things which I think are the most important, and hopefully will help you guys in your career and in your growth teams. Thank you.
Wow. Thank you so much. And that's time. We still have time for Q&A session real quick.
I can see everybody now. It's great.
Thank you. Thanks a lot for a great presentation. You've mentioned Creative Cloud and Lightroom CC. What's the North Star metric for Lightroom CC right now, and have you guys changed it over time since the time you launched it?
Yeah, so great question. So the North Star metric, in my opinion, it's not constant. It changes, right? Because you have a certain set of hypotheses. You do qual and quant. You come up with certain metrics, and then you test it. You A/B test it to see whether or not it's validated. Because when you do an analysis, it's mostly correlation, right? It's not causation. So you want to test it, and you want to do user feedback, and then keep improving on your metric. So I won't go into the specifics of what the exact metric was for Lightroom. It was around edits, number of edits, certain number of times, and that has evolved over a period of time. For paid users. For paid users. Trial users, the window is so small, like they have a trial period of 14 days, you don't get so much signal about what they exactly do, versus a longer window, a 58 or 56-day window, would give you an idea about what they did initially, what they did later, who are the people who are lower engaged in the first 28 days, and they became high engaged in the next 28 days. What is it that they do differently, which gets them to that path? Yeah, end goal was, I would say, engagement and then retention.
Hello, thank you very much for interesting lecture. So my question is that growth teams actually, I think, have a lot of influence and information, and I have like an experience of working with startups and early stage teams, and it looks like in the beginning the information flow is really weak, and like these growth teams, I assume that, and I have it in my experience, they like have a lot of information, and the information flow is not so good. So how do you solve it in your cases? And like, does it depend like on the amount of people in the team, in the company? And yeah, like we kind of solve it in previous with my previous experience. And first solution was having a lot of meetings, but yeah, it's definitely not a go solution. So
yeah,
thank you.
No, I think that's such an important question because it's needed to build trust with your broader organization, right? That transparency, sharing that information, and getting that information from others. So one of the things that we did for testing, we use Airtable at Adobe, and Airtable is pretty much can be viewed by anyone who has the link to all the experiments that are being tracked there. So the experiments have clear KPIs. You can say whether a test was significant or not. If it was significant, are we planning to roll it out to production, and so on. So that's like your meat, right? Then there is your project plan, the things that you're doing, the things in your pipeline. For all of that, we use Wiki, and where we share Wiki is like pretty much open to all of the employees within Adobe, and they get a view into what is it the growth team are focused on or working on. And so they can partner if there are certain areas, like we want to show videos to train or get people to learn things faster. There's a team that's producing those videos. We can bring that in, and they'll be happy to partner. So I think those are two things that we do. I know, I was watching Casey Winter's, video, one of the video. He's one of the great influencers of growth, and one of the things that he said was he used to share, or his team shared meeting notes with bigger, like most of the. I mean, if you're a startup, it's not such a big group, right? So at Uber, we did the same. Any test that was successful was shared with a bigger group, everybody in the company. So some people chose to read it, some didn't, but just share it over email instead of having a meeting. Meeting is just a time suck.
Okay, we have a question here.
Okay. Hi.
Hi.
Thank you for your presentation. And my question is, what are the KPI for a growth marketing team? Like, how do they measure the success? Because if you're talking about entering new markets or new audience, that might be expensive. A/B test usually fails, so it is expensive as well. So what is the KPI for a team?
KPI for a team.
Thank
So
you.
in my team, for my specific team, the KPI is around what are the ideas that you're bringing, or what are the big needle movers that you're bringing, right? So that's number one, is how big are these ideas, right? In terms of impact, in terms of the effort, meaning low effort. And so since it's an analytics and insights team, that's how I gauge them, right? Second is around how many experiments are you saying no to, right? Because more than doing experiments, it's doing the right experiments, right? If you're doing onboarding, and you have like 20,000 users every week who are coming in, it's going to take you a long time to see any result, right? And growth teams don't have, cannot afford the luxury of waiting for like 8 weeks or 10 weeks, or execs are getting impatient, right? So you would want to focus on experiments that are much more bigger. So that's a controversial KPI for my team, but how many experiments do you say no to, right? So that the teams get focused and work on the most important things.
Just one little question, like, do you consider a profit or profitability as a KPI for your team? Especially for, no. Okay, thank you.
No.
Okie dokie. Like, one last question, and then we'll switch to the panel. And the panel will be, again, about teams, processes, challenges, and everything. So we're kind of going in the same flow. Don't worry if you did not ask this question now. Okay, but last question, yes.
Hi, can you speak up a little bit about the differences of doing like cross marketing in a startup when the Uber was startup, and now I guess it's completely different for you when you're working in Adobe, which is an established company. What are the difference for you, like the leader?
Yeah, I think with a bigger company, since teams have already been established, it becomes important to focus on areas and build that relationship with an existing team and carve out the responsibility for your team, right? In terms of what are you going to do differently than a broader marketing team is already doing, right? That becomes such an important conversation, because otherwise it's just going to be like, turf wars, right? So I think for that you need an exec level buy-in, and you need to have a clear vision of what your growth team is doing. And in case of Adobe, there's a clear space where the intersection between product and marketing is a gap, right? Historically, the marketing team did a lot of brand and batch and blast stuff, and the product team focused on the core product, but the intersection was where it was missing, and that's where my team comes and plays that role. Whereas in a startup, you had Ed, who was at Facebook and who was running the growth team, international growth team there. It becomes easier for him to come in and establish the team. And so the growth team there can take a much broader scope and go more, be more fierce in terms of the things that they want to do.
Thank you.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you.